Welcome to Nerds at Church, a podcast about nerdery and the Bible. I'm Pastor Emily, and I use pronouns like they, them, theirs.
And I'm Pastor Kay, and my pronouns are she, her. In this episode, we'll discuss the sixth Sunday after Epiphany, also known as Lectionary 6 or Proper 1. Just ask the Episcopalians about that one. It's a long story, which this year falls on February 12th.
Also, we have our exciting quarterly Patreon thank you.
Yay!
And yay, Patreon supporters. We are up to 8 Patreon supporters. Yay,
Excellent.
you all.
Indeed.
Probably once we get up to at least 12, then we'll just rotate and do a couple every episode.
So that's an exciting reason to sign up to be one of our Patreons. But for now, let's list some of our favorite people, Emily. One of my favorite people is Paul Bennett.
I love Juniper Linberry.
Lowell Chilton, thank you very much.
Jules and Claire Acklow are awesome.
Lori Kaiser Boswell is fantastic.
Erin Holmgren is stupendous.
Pace Warfield is obviously one of our favorites for so many reasons.
Indeed. And Bridget Watley. Thank you so much for your ongoing Patreon support, patronage-ishness of us.
Just throw as many vowels in there as you happen to feel like. We are delighted to know you. Absolutely.
Exactly.
We do have one content notification for you for this episode. We fairly briefly discuss abuse and violence during the deep dive.
Also, check out the episode description for links to the Bible passages and other references we make in this episode.
So our deep dive this week, decided thanks to our gospel reading for today, is on anger.
Indeed. First off, what has apparently missed many people, stares in toxic masculinity, anger is an emotion. Anyone who tells you otherwise is wrong. Anger is an emotion. Or selling something, or both. Anger is decidedly an emotion. For a lot of people, it can connect to or be a response to shame or fear or hurt or trauma. So those feelings can then kind of convert into anger, sometimes as a defense mechanism, sometimes as just an unprocessed step that, especially when it comes from a place of trauma, it's important to note that that is something that in the past has probably kept that person safe. It might not be what is needed to stay safe in the future, but in the past, that's what kept the person safe probably.
On the other hand, it may have also gotten some other people killed, depending on
also possible. Yeah.
Speaking of which, remember kids, murder bad.
Indeed.
Anger is an emotion. That does not mean that it is a legal defense to a crime, unless perhaps you're a cop in some parts of America, or a reason that you get to be a jerk. Being angry is fine. Sharing that anger in ways that hurts other people is the problem. And anger that is used as an excuse for interpersonal violence is frequently just a cover so that the violence and or abuse can continue. It's not about the anger.
True.
I remember a classic question that is often asked to people who are wondering if their spouse is abusive is, if your spouse gets angry and starts breaking things, do they just break your stuff, or do they break stuff that belongs to both of you? 9 times out of 10, the answer is they never break anything that belongs to them themselves, and actually it's a cycle of abuse. Yeah.
I had not.
And for a lot of people, that's the light bulb question. I got that from a book called Why Does He Do That?, which is available online for free as a PDF in many different places. You can just Google it. And it's by Lundy Bancroft. And it has a red cover with the title in very large letters on it. It's a very good source for learning about how does cis-het domestic abuse work. There's an LGBT chapter that is not great and extremely dated these days. But if you are in a heterosexual relationship, it is worth looking at.
That's good to know. Yeah. Also, if Kay's question just made you think or wonder or gave you your own realization about a relationship that you are in, we will link to this in our episode description. But also, you can call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 800-799-SAFE. So that's 800-799-7233.
Thank you,
Stay
Emily.
safe, folks.
Absolutely. So, as we move through life, many of us often discover that there are several types of anger that we may feel, and the vast majority of them aren't necessarily abusive or violent in any way. But these are emotions that we will feel during the course of our life.
So one of the forms of anger, and my personal favorite, is righteous anger. So this is anger that frequently is in response to injustice in some capacity or oppression or something like that. So my favorite kind of trifecta of it is based on the Enneagram. So I am an Enneagram 5. One of my closest friends and chosen family is an 8, and another one is a 2. And there's this pattern that happens with 582. And so for me as a 5, when I see someone else being harmed or when I see injustice happening, especially to other people, I will aid out. I'll get a lot more assertive. I will express my anger. I will challenge it, that sort of thing. It's a great like anti-bullying tactic for me. If I see the bullying, then I'll be like, hey, just as long as it's not against me, because that gets complicated.
It's easier to help others than it is to help yourself sometimes, yes.
It really is. And for an 8 who is more easily the kind of person who will have a very strong reaction, they're very intense, when they are expressing anger in kind of an integrated sense, in a like healthy way, it's usually that they are acting more like a 2. So they are caring for others and so forming the like protection for others and challenging the injustice that others are experiencing. So I really kind of like that. But this is what we see with protests, with uprisings, with the responses to all of the gun violence that is happening everywhere, particularly in this country.
Yeah.
It's a response to the police violence that we see, also a valid response to police violence, which continues to happen throughout this country in particular, especially thinking about Memphis and Tyree Nichols. We're recording this on the day that the video of his brutal murder is being released. So thinking about that a lot, and the very righteous anger that is likely to come from the fuller truth being out about what those 5 officers did to him.
Yeah. And remember, folks, just because the media releases a violent video doesn't mean that you have to watch it. Please do take care of yourselves, and let's honor his memory.
Especially if you can just believe what people are saying. Believe the family. Believe them. Don't watch it. That does not need to be watched or entertainment.
Yeah. So another and very different kind of anger, which I have a personal relationship with, let's say, I guess. I've had an interesting relationship with this type of anger my whole life, which is to say petty or irrational anger. And for me, this is really the one kind of anger that I will genuinely attempt to not share with other people, because I know that this is anger I'm not supposed to be feeling. Like, it has no basis in fact. It's really pretty, like, immature and small of me. And yet this also happens. Like, this is anger I feel, and on a reasonably common basis, because I am a human being. And my favorite story that is an example of this is, so my husband and I purchased a cookbook several years ago now called The Cook's Illustrated Cookbook, which basically, this is put out by America's Test Kitchen, and they took all of your classic dishes that like lots of people love to make, and they messed with them until they found the best possible version of them. And so if you want the best possible chicken soup, if you want the best possible cake, if you want the best possible meatballs, whatever, all of these recipes are going to be just a little weird. They're going to contain some slightly unusual ingredients. They're going to involve some slightly more involved steps to making the dish, but it will be the best thing you've ever tasted of that type. And there is a brownie recipe. There is a brownie recipe that I think is called something like the triple chocolate fudge brownies, something like that. And these are the best brownies I have ever heard of, let alone had myself. And so my husband makes these brownies on occasion, not too often, because they are actually a little complicated. Like, there are 3 different kinds of chocolate, thus the triple chocolate, and you have to melt some of it in a double boiler. So, like, it's involved, but oh my goodness, they are so worth it. And I will now always remember the time I walked into the kitchen and I smelled the very distinctive, oh, those are the special brownies, triple chocolate smell.
Not that
And
kind of special, listener.
no. And so I walked into the kitchen, I smelled that magical brownie smell that I knew was the best brownies in the history of existence. He had actually only made these brownies maybe 3 or 4 times before this, so they were still kind of new in our lives. And his back was to me. He was stirring something while he was making the brownies. And I asked him when they'd be ready, and he explained that he wasn't actually making them for me. He was making them for one of our neighbors as a thank you for something that that person had done. And I paused for a moment there, and this wave of unbelievably strong anger came over me. I could actually like feel it moving through my body, the heat that hits your face when that happens, you know?
Yeah.
And then I realized what I was angry about. And then I had to have a very stern, very fast, very silent conversation with myself where I reminded myself that my husband making brownies for someone else did not actually count as adultery. He was not cheating on me. And then I, said something nondescript and wandered off. And several days later, I was actually calmed down enough that I could tell him this story and explain what had happened. Because he didn't look at me during this story. He was busy putting ingredients together. So he didn't realize what had happened at the time. And it is totally fine for him to make brownies for whoever he wants. But also, ever since then, I have called these brownies the monogamy brownies. Because it was kind of the obvious choice. So, like, I recognize that that is petty and irrational anger on my part. And also, we have both learned that if we're going to make those brownies for someone else, we make 2 batches at once.
I was going to say double batch that.
But yeah, that was an important lesson in both my marriage relationship and also my level of maturity as an adult.
That is fantastic. The best brownies I have ever had actually come from a box.
Okay.
They had different flavors. So they had like a raspberry brownie and a peppermint brownie or whatever. And it's literally like the mix. And then you add one of those like mini cups of vanilla yogurt.
Interesting. Okay, sure.
It was amazing. We got it at the co-op when I was in college, and I have never had as good of a brownie since then. So now I'm curious. Another type of anger that Kay did not choose to express in that situation, but could have. Is
probably, yes. We were in Minnesota at the time.
Passive-aggressive anger is a particular language that I don't really speak very well, but it is when people refuse to acknowledge and to express and to be clear about their anger. And so instead they like act really nice, or they say things and the words mean one thing and the tone means another. It's a very like white Midwesterner kind of thing. It is part of why I think being nice is a sin, because frequently passive-aggressive anger is being nice. One of the most common ways that this like is revealed, particularly for me as someone who did not grow up with passive-aggressive anger, is anonymous feedback, right? So there's the like, nobody's talking to you about it, nobody's telling you about concerns, or nobody's telling you that they're not quite happy, or they're worried, or they're angry, or they're upset. And then inevitably, those are also, for me as a pastor, the congregations that do anonymous surveys for feedback and evaluation of staff. And then in the anonymous survey, all of this stuff comes out, or even like one thing, but it's like out of left field because you didn't know, because nobody actually said the thing.
Yeah, folks, if anyone ever suggests at any of your jobs that they put out an anonymous suggestion box, just shoot that down right away. It's going to be terrible. Don't bother.
Yeah. And if it's at Starbucks, then it's just a union bust.
Sure. In which case, just put in notes that are about how awesome unions are. But
yeah, and how terrible the corporation is.
So, speaking of other kinds of anger, there's also what I tend to think of as perfectly reasonable anger. Like, we've been talking about anger that gets weird or difficult, but also sometimes it is entirely reasonable because of what's going on for you to be angry, even if your anger is not a righteous anger exactly. My most memorable example of this when I was still in school is What if you're doing a group project and one of the members of the group is not pulling their weight and not doing their fair share of the work? You may feel perfectly reasonable anger. You will probably have to do a little work in order to resolve that problem and also, the emotions that you and possibly other people are experiencing. But sometimes, when you look at what's going on in your life, it is entirely reasonable for you to be angry. And, as we look at the world today, there may be several reasons why you are angry for perfectly reasonable reasons at the world. And we can't blame you for that either.
It's true. We have in our household, we talk about halt. We actually talk about chalt, the C being, are you caffeinated? But whenever you're upset about something or something like that, to ask, are you caffeinated? Are you hungry? Are you angry? Are you lonely? Are you tired? Or thirsty? And that frequently, like, solving those can lead to, oh, okay, this is what's really going on.
Yeah. And then also, in terms of how a person experiences anger, I have occasionally met people who aren't familiar with this distinction, but most folks, I think, are familiar with it, which is to say experiencing cold anger versus hot anger. So hot anger is the type that I described earlier with the brownie story, with the hot flush that like runs over your face and you are extremely angry. It probably comes on very quickly, and usually hot anger leads to a lot of shouting or raised voices or possibly like really enthusiastic gestures.
Or punching a light post.
Okay. I think the light post is going to win that argument.
Oh, it did.
Okay.
I come from a hot anger family.
Sure, but in my family, if someone is still yelling at you, you're probably mostly okay. Like, they're angry, but you can fix this. If, on the other hand, they switch into cold anger, which is where they stop yelling at you, they get very quiet. Their voice starts getting a little lethal, and they have clearly calmed all the way down. That is when you start wondering if you're going to have to move across the country. Or possibly make them really excellent brownies, like every day for a year or something. But yeah, that cold anger, when you are no longer filled with that flush of hot anger, when it is no longer a matter of adrenaline and being all hopped up on brain chemicals, and instead, cold anger is what I usually refer to as fury, to be honest with you. I have known people who think of furious as like a particularly enthusiastic type of hot anger, but in my experience and in my family, actual fury or furiousness, that's cold anger. That can last for quite a long time.
The seething,
the
deep burn.
I'll talk about this more in a minute. I went for decades without experiencing cold anger, and then the pandemic happened. And then I found out that people were choosing convenience over the safety of others. And then my streak died. So.
Yeah, I was trying to think of an example that doesn't have to do with a certain turf. And what I ended up landing on is in the Hunger Games. It almost is like, and this would be a like problematic situation, right? Because it's from the perspective, like it's from the characters.
Well, I mean, you're in the Hunger Games. Everything is problematic. Like they're murdering children. Yeah.
True. But like the peacekeepers are examples of hot anger. Like they respond with violence and they respond immediately. And even when it's not with violence, like the response is big and is really fast. But President Snow is very much cold anger. Like it simmers and it just gets deeper and deeper and burns for literally forever until he dies.
And I guess, speaking of which, another pop culture example of hot versus cold anger is that cold anger is Bruce Banner and hot anger is the Hulk. The Hulk is when he lets the anger out. But as he says, he's always angry.
That's a good one. I hadn't thought of that one. Speaking of being angry, which is what we're talking about this whole deep dive, another type of anger that I experience a lot is to be angry and not realize that you're angry. So for me, it happens all the time. Like I am not the first person to realize I'm angry. I don't express it in like really big hot anger kind of ways, but I'm not the first one to recognize that something's off. And I'm working on it, right? Working on figuring out what's going on. A lot of it, when you don't realize you're angry, is connected, in my experience at least, to trauma and trauma triggers. So like for me, the only power I had as a kid was in being right. I was not bigger. I was not stronger. I was not any of that other stuff. But if I was right, I at least had some little
Sure.
bit of power. And so now that comes back. And if I'm in a situation where I know I'm right, or someone's not believing me or something like that, it can trip that trauma and I can start to get angry. And I don't know, like I just get disgruntled and then frustrated and then angry,
Yeah.
depending on how it proceeds. But it's not something that I like recognize right away. It takes time, and then it's like, oh, that's what was going on. Okay. And then talking about it and processing and then
Yeah.
moving in a different direction.
Yeah. Well, and just as our experiences can change how we experience anger, also who we are as people and our own neurodiversity can certainly impact how we experience anger. I
Mm-hmm.
have ADHD that quite frequently brings about issues with impulsiveness. And for a lot of kids with ADHD, that means that you have more trouble with having a temper than your peers do. I
Mm.
realized when I was a kid, probably around 7 or 8, that I didn't get angry. Well, I got angry fairly often because I wasn't being treated well at school. I was being bullied a lot. But
Mm-hmm.
it didn't go bad places all that often, but it started to go bad places often enough that I realized when I was about 8 years old that if I did not get a handle on my temper, I was going to turn into somebody that no one wanted to be around, including myself. And so for
Mm.
about the next decade until I was 18, I ignored all other social lessons and maturation, processes, and I've solely focused on getting my temper under control. It was the only thing I was
Mm.
actually worried about. I did not bother learning almost any other social lessons aside from the very basic bare bones of how to be polite from my parents for those 10 years because my temper scared the crap out of me.
Yeah.
And on the one hand, my temper is still very much under control. I managed to learn and pick up and sometimes just make up because I didn't really have a lot of resources for this.
Mm-hmm.
I was mostly working off like fiction and people I knew and what I observed in other people and things like that. And I did have a small group for a couple years about that age for kids who were going through troubles when my parents got divorced. And that probably gave me some useful tools as well, although my memories
Mm.
of that are kind of fuzzy. But I focused on things like learning how to control my breathing, doing a number countdown. There's a bit in Orson Scott Card's Ender's Game novel where the main character calms himself down several times, usually to stop himself from crying, by
Mm.
doubling numbers. He'll start with a number and he'll just keep doubling it until he can't do the math in his head anymore. And I found that pretty helpful. And
Mm-hmm.
essentially, what that wound up doing was that for a lot of my emotions, including the ones that hit very unexpectedly, I can still to this day choose which emotions I'm going to share with other people, which some folks
Mm.
find kind of weird. And I have had it suggested to me that it suggests autism, which is a common thing that goes along with ADHD. I'm not sure
Mm-hmm.
that's the case in my case due to various other things. I have a number of mental health professionals who have known me since childhood, and none of them think that autism is likely for me.
Mm-hmm.
But I think this is where that comes from, that I learned how to recognize and sort of lasso the emotion before I shared it with someone else, and then I could decide whether I was going to share it, particularly with
Mm.
anger. But eventually it sort of went out to other different kinds of emotions too. And so if you know someone with ADHD who also has something of a temper problem or impulsivity issues, that's not a surprise. That's not unusual. And there are now quite a few resources out there to help folks. And especially if you have a diagnosis or have started figuring some things out about yourself, there are places
Mm-hmm.
for folks with ADHD where you can go and learn more.
Yeah. And ADHD also, I was just saw an article that ADHD and PTSD also have a higher correlation because of kind of the different ways that brains work. And so that also would be a contributing factor, right? Where if you are dealing with PTSD, especially complex PTSD and ADHD at the same time, then anger takes on different forms and can be that sort of a situation.
Sure.
Yeah. And a lot of it for like people who love people who
Mm-hmm.
are quick to anger, especially if it comes from a trauma place. Like getting mental health support and therapy and all of those things is really important. And patience is just
Yes.
huge of like, okay, like how do we de escalate? How do we back up? how do we take breaks?
Yes.
In arguing in our household, there is always, okay, I need a break.
Yeah.
And then we can come back together once all of the adrenaline and everything has come back down, which is really helpful.
When my husband and I got married, we made an agreement that during an argument we could always say, okay, I need a break. We would hug. We would take 5 minutes away from each other, and then we'd come back. And that has helped quite a bit several times. Also, I want to throw out there while we're talking about therapy that just because therapy is good and just because a particular therapist has been helpful for someone else does not mean that they're going to be helpful for you. Please find the right provider for you, not for someone else.
Yes. Don't stick with somebody just because you feel like you have to. You can change providers.
Yes. You're interviewing them, especially the first time, to see if they're right for you.
Yeah. Another way to deal with and process anger, especially if you feel like it gets bottled up or you're not sure how to process it or it kind of explodes out verbally or otherwise, is through anger workouts. So I learned about this when I was doing my CP residency, and it actually is super not my thing. When we started doing it, I had to literally leave the room because it was too much for my ears to have everybody doing it. Some very important guidelines, and we are not professionals, so
well, we are professionals, but not in this. Yes.
Yeah. So do your actual research before you try any of this, but anger workouts should never harm you or someone else, any other living creature. But we used either a rag or towel or one of those pool noodles, and then just hit it against the wall, against a wooden piece of furniture, against a door, something like that. And having that movement and the loud thwack helped to kind of release out. I think it's probably in a similar way to how crying actually releases some chemicals that you can't get out other ways. I think when anger gets bottled up, you got to find ways to release it, and physical workouts, that sort of thing, can be ways to release it. And so anger workouts can be those. I've also at camp, we would go in the walk-in fridge or the walk-in freezer and shut the door and then just yell as loud as we could. And it was really helpful.
Although, make sure that the door will open again from the inside before you shut yourself in there.
Yes, that's actually a safety code now.
Oh, good.
Yeah. You should not be able to lock yourself in.
Yeah, one would hope, yeah. Assuming that, of course, it's up to safety code. I was also reminded, as you were talking about smacking things, I was reminded of that scene in the episode of Firefly where they're transporting the herd of cattle and they're bringing them out of the ship, and Captain Mal points out to crewman Jane that the cattle will go just fine exactly where you want them to if you lead them, and Jane replies, I like smacking them, which makes a lot of sense because Jane clearly has some ongoing anger issues, and so.
Yeah.
But speaking of anger in pop culture.
Oh my gosh. Look at us. We're doing such great transitions today. I'm so proud of us.
Only for the podcast, Emily.
Truth. One of the most iconic angers in pop culture is, of course, from the movie Inside Out, where the emotions of the protagonist are literally embodied inside their head. What's interesting in this is also that, the main character seems to be non-binary because there's a variety of genders inside their head, as opposed to the other characters. When we see inside their heads, it matches their gender identity, their gender expression.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
So either non-binary or gender fluid or any number of,
something. Yeah. So anger is red hot, and you're kind of always waiting in the movie for the volcanic explosion from anger's head. And I really love that, and particularly the way that Inside Out, the arc of the story, to get to a place where at first it's every memory, everything has to only have joy. Sure. And the other four emotions are bad emotions. And then it gets more complicated as life is more complicated. But I really love that it is expressed as an emotion, and it's a really clear emotion.
Sure.
Also, one time when I was doing hospital chaplaincy, we had a pumpkin carving contest, and we definitely made all 5 emotions as pumpkins. And it was glorious and so much fun. Yeah.
I am also reminded of a scene from the, I believe, first season of Supergirl, which I can tell you it was the first season of Supergirl because that was the season I watched. But there was a scene where Supergirl and James, Jimmy Olsen, bond over not being able to show anger in their everyday lives. Her because she is a white woman in a professional setting, and him because he is a black man, and black men are not exactly encouraged to show anger in a lot of places in America.
So. Yeah, the tropes around anger, especially connected to race, are really harmful, especially to black men and black women, like the angry black woman. Doctor Who is one of the characters who frequently expresses calculated or cold anger. So it feels very calculated, it feels very cold, very intentional, is usually expressed by some passionate monologue that details for whatever villain why the Doctor's upset and how the villain is going to lose as they are losing.
Although, to be fair, I mean, he goes through, well, and I'm sure later the 13th Doctor also goes through many different kinds of anger. My personal favorite example of the Doctor with irrational or petty anger was when the 11th Doctor was with child Amy Pond, and she was giving him different things to eat, and he didn't like any of them until he got to the fish fingers and custard, and he kept throwing them out the front door.
So. Yes. Yeah. He's also the one that I think of. 11 and 10 are both the ones that I think of for the passionate monologue.
Yeah, whereas the 9th Doctor was so terrified of his own anger because he had just been through an incredibly traumatic experience that he very rarely showed any anger at all. You really had to ramp him up before he would. So, if you're looking to learn more about anger as an emotion and also many, many, many other emotions that we feel, the book Atlas of the Heart by Brene Brown literally gives a few dozen types of emotions and then spends a couple pages on each of them. And it's a little bit of an emotional roller coaster if you're kind of going through something while you read it. If you're already in a highly emotional place, it can be kind of difficult to get through. But I don't know what it would be like to read it while your life was normal and not any trouble at all, but I'm sure that would be interesting. And her explanations of the different types of anger and the different ways that anger interacts with other emotions are really helpful and insightful and very mature. And so I very much appreciated that book. It's not my favorite of hers, but it is a good book.
Nice. If you're looking at anger from maybe a younger perspective, one book that I read growing up, and I'm not sure how much I like it now, it's frequently used as a stress management kind of book for kids, is Don't Pop Your Cork on Mondays by Adolph Mosher.
That's a fun title.
I remember reading it as a kid. I don't remember all of the details about it, so I don't remember if it's a never get mad or don't let your anger get so big, but that's one. The one that I really love is Grump, Groan, Growl by Bell Hooks and Chris Roshka. And that really goes from a kid's perspective into just the validity of grumpiness, of anger, of emotions that frequently we say are bad emotions or negative emotions. They're just emotions.
Yeah.
They're real, and it's important to affirm for kids that those are real and valid emotions. So I will always, shamelessly plug any books by Bell Hooks and Chris Roshka.
Oh, sure.
Because I'm biased.
Yeah, very valid.
And now, as we dive into our readings for this episode, our first reading is Deuteronomy 30, verses 15 through 20. God has given the commandments to humanity as a gift and also guidelines, which will let us live long, blessed lives. However, ignoring them will have consequences. So, one of the underlying themes in this passage is colonizers gonna colonize. God is talking about the people of Israel going into this land that God promised them that's already occupied. So that, sounds familiar. Something that happened in this country, and, that's how colonialism works. But this reminded me of the movie Black Adam, which I recently watched from the DC universe. And Black Adam comes into being in Kandak, which is a country that is run by a crime syndicate called Intergang. So they're in a situation where they are oppressed and occupied, and nobody else in the world cares. The Justice League doesn't care. And then when Black Adam comes up and they are like, oh, there's this new guy named Black Adam and he has superpowers, then the Justice League comes in to fight Black Adam, not to address the injustice and the oppression and the violence and the occupation of the Intergang, but to fight Black Adam. And so it's like, okay, colonizer's gonna colonize. Let's actually try to focus. And that's what we usually think of with God, is like a care for the oppressed and justice for the oppressed. But in this particular situation, because of how the stories get told and because of how scripture is written, we get, you're going into this land, you're going to take over, and maybe try and do some good things too.
Sure.
It's complicated. And then in verse 15, we read, see, I have set before you today life and prosperity, death and adversity. And it reminded me of, so the Daily Show right now, as many of you may know, is having different guests host it. And Wanda Sykes was hosting last night, and she had been watching football and saw this ad during the football game by the oil and gas companies. Not even like specific ones, just in general, talking about how everything is made up of gas and oil, and if you didn't have it, things would just like dissolve into thin air. Mm-hmm. And so she had like the like person reporting, like satire reporting from the scene of an oil spill. And there's like ducks covered in oil and all of this thing, and it's just like this juxtaposition of like that she does of like, what would life be like without gas and oil? And there's like this beautiful scene with green grass, and she's like, what is that green stuff on the ground?
Look at those happy penguins.
Yeah. And that is where we're at in a lot of ways in the world, is life and prosperity, death and adversity. Are we going to address climate change? Because that's the...
Yeah. I definitely read that verse and went a little bit more lighthearted, I guess. Which is to say, my first thought, of course, was Portal, the video game, which I did actually play through about a year ago. And during the game, as you go on and you discover that the computer who is putting you through these tests is not, either sane or benevolent in some ways, it offers you the choice between cake or death, which seems pretty straightforward, to be fair. And you actually spend a fair amount of time in the game thinking that there isn't any cake, but then when you finish the game, there is a cake. But you can't take any, you can only see it. Oh. And I know.
Where's the fun in that?
And it also reminded me of a sketch that Eddie Izzard used to do back in the day. I don't know if she still does it, but I don't know which came first, Portal or Eddie Izzard's cake or death speech. Eddie's version involves the Anglican Church somehow. And I don't remember the full setup to it, but the idea is that you're basically at a church potluck and someone offers you cake, and then the other option is death for some reason. And, they're all very polite and British about it. And it's pretty hilarious. And then eventually they run out of cake, and it's very sad.
Oh, no.
Because Eddie's version recognizes that cake is finite. So
truth. And then in verse 16 we read, if you obey the commandments of the everlasting your God that I am commanding you today, by loving the everlasting your God, walking in God's ways, and observing their commandments, decrees, and ordinances, then you shall live and become numerous, and the everlasting your God will bless you in the land that you are entering to possess. Now, to be clear, walking in God's ways is not walking exactly in God's footsteps through the desert so that they don't know our numbers because we're not actually Tuscan Raiders. It's okay to be numerous and to allow people to know that.
So it wasn't that Jesus was carrying me. It was that we were walking in each other's footsteps. Exactly. I made a reference in passing to the Footsteps poem during a confirmation class a few weeks ago, and the kids had no idea what I was talking about.
Yeah.
And I couldn't decide whether I should be happy or unhappy about that, because on the one hand, I felt old, and on the other hand, like, if we're going to get rid of a piece of Christian classic stuff, then I am totally okay with letting go of that one.
That's fair.
Yeah. And then in verse 18 we read, I declare to you today that you shall perish. You shall not live long in the land that you are crossing the Jordan to enter and possess.
Rude.
I mean, to be fair, Moses isn't going to cross the Jordan to enter and possess anything, although I don't know that he knows that yet. But this also reminded me of a quest in the game of Skyrim, there is a lighthouse that you can find on a coastline up north, and it's called the Frostflow Lighthouse. And from the outside, it looks like a perfectly normal lighthouse, except that the beacon at the top isn't lit. And as you go inside, you discover a bit of a mess, and there's a hole in the back of the fireplace, and there's a dead body. And as you go through and you start exploring, you realize that a family had moved into this lighthouse and they had bought it. They were all excited about finally owning their own home. And then they started hearing weird noises at night. And then one night something broke through the fireplace. And then it turns out that the scary monsters from underground called the Falmer were breaking into the house and attacked people. And it all went rather badly. So that is what immediately came to mind for you shall not live long in that land that you are going to enter and possess, because they did not last very long in that house. So if you buy yourself a new house and you start hearing creepy sounds coming out of the basement, investigating them is one option, but also make sure you have some backup.
Yeah. I was thinking of Pace and I have been planning our Horror Nerds at Church next season, and so I was thinking about The Haunted House, I think is the name of the movie, but there's a movie coming out with a family who moves into a haunted house. And I think Eddie Murphy's in it, is the dad in it, and a similar thing. They don't know it's haunted when they move in, and then what are those noises and sounds? And the town knows that it's haunted. And,
come to think of it, I think I have seen, I can't remember any of them offhand, but I have seen a few comedy sketches specifically by African-American comics who are very clear that a black family would react very differently than a white family to a haunted house.
Mm-hmm.
And so I kind of wonder now if that movie, if Eddie Murphy's in it, will share some of those, because...
Yeah, I don't know. It looks good, and it's... Mm-hmm. But, yeah.
Sure. So our second reading for this episode is from 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 1 through 9. Paul places the true power of faith and the church with God, explaining that in comparison to God, the people of the church in Corinth are like newborn infants.
So one of the themes in this passage is the movement from conflict, which we talked about a couple weeks ago because it happened, Paul was talking about it earlier in this book, into collaboration. And I was thinking about this, and that's the journey of the Expanse in many ways for the crew of the Rocinante is to move from conflict with everybody, they're not on anybody's sides, to moving into collaboration and deeper relationship with the Belters, and then eventually also the Earthers and the Martians, because conflict can become collaboration with some creativity.
And, brownies probably don't hurt.
And monogamy brownies. I don't know that I'm going to call them monogamy brownies, but...
No, they're also the Cook's Illustrated triple chocolate fudge brownies.
There you go. Yeah. Speaking of brownies, they go really well with milk.
They do.
In verse 2, Paul writes, I fed you with milk, not solid food, for you were not ready for solid food. Even now you are still not ready. And one of my friends, I guess it would be 9 months ago now, we were texting back and forth, and she was talking about her kid and that they hadn't started weaning yet because they were doing baby-led weaning. I was like, oh. And the kid was wanting food and trying to grab food, but actually baby-led weaning is more complicated. So not only does the kid have to want it, but they have to be at least 6 months. They have to be able to sit up with minimal support. They can't do this tongue thrusting reflex, and they have to be interested in food and able to bring objects to their mouth easily. And then you start weaning them and giving them food to try and stuff. But it was interesting for me because I hadn't heard about all of those pieces of baby-led weaning. So it sounds like Paul maybe needs to know a little bit more, but is also doing the right thing and waiting until they're ready for solid foods before he feeds them solid foods.
Consent is important, folks. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And then in verse 3 we read, For you are still of the flesh, for as long as there is jealousy and quarreling among you, are you not of the flesh and behaving according to human inclinations? I really hope I don't have to tell you this, but heads up, growing in your spiritual journey as a Christian will not actually make you an incorporeal spiritual being capable of possessing, say, a spaceship, like River Tam may have done during that one Firefly episode. You will, in fact, still have your body and or meat suit, as the internet calls it, and you will still be a corporeal being. So I hope that was not helpful to anyone, because if you really thought that that was going to happen, then there are some other issues going on there. But just so long as you know. And then also in verse 6 we read, I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. This is a lovely example of Paul actually giving someone else credit for something, which doesn't happen super often. So like I wanted to just put a flag on it. But also, I don't know why exactly. I don't think I had ever really focused on this part of this First Corinthians reading. I think I usually focused on the previous bit that we had last week. But I had always kind of assumed before that Apollos, on that list of people, when Paul says, you are saying, I belong to Paul, I belong to Apollos, I belong to Cephas, I belong to Christ. I had always kind of figured that Apollos was like the bad option of that list, maybe because like one of them is Paul and one of them is Cephas, who is Peter, and one of them is Jesus, who like is not clearly the bad option. So I think I had it in my head that like Apollos was an early heretic of some kind, and I don't know exactly where that came from. Exactly, yeah. And so no, he's apparently just the guy who came in after Paul did to continue to teach people, which of course is way less of a glamorous or apparently a memorable job, because we know all kinds of stuff about Paul and we only get Apollos' name like twice and that's it. But it also reminds me of how the second contact teams are treated in the TV show Star Trek Lower Decks, where we get to meet the teams who go in after the first contact teams who make first communications with a new alien race. You also need somebody to go in again to continue that conversation and have the, slightly less glamorous and exciting later conversations. And those second contact teams don't get nearly as much credit.
Yeah. Yeah. That's fascinating to me because you don't have to have any of them be a bad option.
I don't know where that came from. Sure.
Yeah. And then in the next verse, in verse 7, we read, so neither the one who plants nor the one who waters is anything, but only God who gives the growth. And sometimes the metaphors that we use for God around planting and vegetation and growing don't really work anymore. Sometimes because we just know the science, and technically we know the science a little bit more on this, but this metaphor really does hold up well, I think, because there is this inherent mystery, this inherent thing that humans can't control that helps the actual growth occur.
Yes, after all, God is the one who, created the vegetation in the first place, even if we have done some minor edits since. Which reminds me of an old joke. It's a very silly joke, but it's actually one of the few funny ones that I remember from my time of people trying to argue with me about whether atheists were decent human beings. The old joke of a atheist arguing with God and saying that, well, fine, I'll just go create my own life from dirt. And God says, go right ahead, I'd be very interested. And the atheist says, okay, so first I need some dirt. And God says, make your own. So,
yeah. I was thinking about broccoli because it's one of the things that we've edited.
Oh, yes, we've created.
We were talking about the vegetation comes from God.
Yes.
Broccoli is an edit. Every once in a while that the whole brassica family tree thing goes around
on Facebook. Yeah.
And then our gospel reading for this week is Matthew chapter 5, verses 21 through 37. Jesus, during the Sermon on the Mount, expands on the meanings of the commandments against murder, adultery, and false witness to show how not following them can inhibit a life in supportive community. So one of the themes in this passage is the idea of nuance or needed context. Jesus is digging deeper into what may at first glance appear to be very simple: do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not bear false witness. And
murder bad.
Murder bad. And it reminded me of the Marvel Cinematic Universe now, because...
Speaking of murder.
Right. We are now at a point in the Marvel Cinematic Universe that if you haven't seen the past episodes or the past movies, you can't totally follow. You have... There are no longer standalone movies. So you have to watch the other movies, or at least get a synopsis. You have to know the context and the nuances of relationships between the characters. Otherwise, it is impossible to follow. And it's hard to follow anyway, but super impossible that way.
And then in verses 23 and 24, we read, so when you are offering your gift at the altar, if you remember that your sibling has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your sibling, and then come and offer your gift. And to this day, Lutheran worship services place the sharing of the peace, where you go and share the peace of God with others around you, before the offering, where we give our money to the church or to ministry, for this very reason. These very verses are the reason why our worship service is organized this way. Also, other churches do similar things, but the Lutheran Church is very particular about how the handshaking time of the service is about sharing God's peace with others. That's the phrase we use. And a lot of other churches won't use exactly that language, even though there is usually another part of the service where that kind of thing is encouraged. So, of course, whether or not this practice is actually authentically healing is up to us individually. So.
Also true. Also, not every Lutheran church does it. And I think it's particularly interesting to me that, like, my home congregation, a pastor came at one point and moved the sharing of the peace, the passing of the peace, to turn and greet your neighbor at the beginning of the service.
A lot of churches that aren't Lutheran do that, yes.
Right. But, like, this also was a pastor who was a source and creator of conflict in the congregation and, like, split the congregation.
Good.
So I was like, yeah.
Telling on yourself much? Yeah.
Yeah, we're not prioritizing peace. We're not prioritizing reconciliation. Yeah. And then in verse 29 and verse 30, if you keep reading, is some of the best verses in the Bible in my own slightly vindictive
favorites. Yes.
Heart. Yeah. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. The next verse is about your hand.
Although, sanitary disposal methods are important, folks. Like, let's not,
Yeah. Cauterize
bodily
wounds
fluids
and
all over
all
the
that
place.
stuff.
Yes, please. Thank you.
But this
also, maybe just don't hurt yourself. But yeah.
This is one of my favorites because so frequently there is, like, the conservative Christian movement of controlling how particularly women and girls are allowed to dress. And I read the book Dress Coded this past summer, and I've talked about it, I think, a couple times, but the middle school in the book is putting all of this pressure on girls through dress coding them, which takes them out of their classes, and it keeps them from being able to participate in class in order to, quote unquote, prevent boys from being able to focus on education. So they don't prevent boys from being able to focus on education. So, like, the exact thing that they say they're trying to prevent is what they are actively doing to the girls in the school. I listened to the audiobook and it's fantastic and I highly recommend.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's if we just followed this, then everyone could be responsible for their own, who they're looking at and what they're doing.
And it's not like there aren't other options available, but of course girls would never look at boys with lust in their hearts because, obviously girls don't do that. So
ever. But it is part of, like, the larger victim blaming that happens as part of rape culture, and that goes with what we were talking about earlier with anger and abuse, that all of those things are connected, right? From little things that maybe seem semi-innocuous, but are connected to a much larger system of violence.
Yeah. And then in verse 32, we read, "But I say to you that anyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of unchastity, causes her to commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery." Okay, so there are multiple essays online about this verse, about half of which I probably wildly disagree with a certain amount of anger, for that matter. And so I'm not going to go into the full speech of exactly the cultural background and the language background that you need to have in order to understand the full context of this verse. But essentially, remember that Jesus' culture worked quite differently than ours does today, and that his teaching here would have given a certain amount of stability to a married woman's life instead of making things more difficult for her and less predictable and less stable. Adultery was incredibly difficult to prove under the rules that they operated under during Jesus's life, and you needed multiple witnesses who weren't related to each other or you, and they all had to say the exact same thing and agree on all kinds of different points. And so that didn't happen very often. And while a married woman might not be in a great situation with her spouse, at least least if she stayed in the same situation, it was predictable, because if she was divorced, her family of origin did not have to take her back, and she wasn't able to earn a living in a variety of ways. All that she would really have available to her was prostitution. And so Jesus making life more stable for married women was ultimately helping them at the time. But again, very different culture, very different time. Also, there's some tricks of language that I'm not going to go into because it would take forever. We can probably find an essay on this verse that goes into a decent amount of depth and link to it in the show notes.
And then in verse 37, Jesus says, "Let your word be yes, yes, or no, no. Anything more than this comes from the evil one. Unless you have prearranged safe words, in which case those trump the yes, no stuff." But it's important to have those prearranged among enthusiastically consenting adults.
Also, usually some signals that aren't vocal will be helpful as well.
Also, you can do this. Consent is possible to teach kids, right? I don't know. I'm sure kids exist that don't like being tickled, but most of the kids in my life like to be tickled, but also like it to stop at certain points and don't necessarily want to say no. So having a tickle game where, okay, orange means go and apple means stop can be a way for them to experience like the tickle game and still be consenting about when their body is touched.
And in other ways, for that matter, when I was a teenager, my parents and I had a word that if I called them from someone else's house and I said that word during our conversation, that meant come get me right now. And so there are a lot of different things that safe words can do.
Yeah. My dad just always told me that I could always blame him if I didn't want to do something. Just blame him.
Yeah. My parents did the same thing.
My dad won't let me. Yeah.
And now for our very least angry segment. Let's make a Muppets musical.
In my head, I kept going for the angriest segment, and I was like, that seems like suboptimal.
I mean, maybe Animal playing the drums occasionally, but like he's, having a good time still, so.
Oh, because I was thinking about Oscar the Grouch, who would be the one who would be characterized as angry, whether or not he was, which I think is something that a lot of people experience. But also the like Elmo versus Rocco thing that happened last year. I didn't follow all of it, but there was a thing between Elmo and Rocco. So if we need to, talk about anger, I think they would both be good. And then, as you said, Animal would be great at like anger workouts on the drums.
Absolutely. Yeah. I was also thinking, after my little epiphany, you might say, about Apollos in our second reading today, I was trying to cast Paul and Apollos and Cephas as Muppets. And so for the person who would go in to do the first contact, sort of the first conversations thing, I know we cast him a lot, but Kermit really is the right person for that. He's very calm. He's very personable. He's very good at using simple words to get good ideas across. And he's also very good at knowing his audience. And you see that at several times. And so I think he's a good cast for Paul. And for Apollos, as the person who goes in and does the further information, but doesn't get the fame or glamour or anything, and yet still has to do a fair amount of the background work, I think Fozzie Bear actually fits nicely, because you'll notice if you watch the Muppets movies and show and so forth, very often the act we don't see, the act that is like preparing people for other stuff, the act that is going on while we're watching something in the background, that's Fozzie Bear doing the work that doesn't get him any credit. And I think part of that is because they can only come up with so many jokes that suit his personality. But he does seem to, like, he is the constant guy who can always be trusted to go on stage and make people laugh at any time with no notice. And I think that's important.
Yeah. I was thinking of Ernie for that.
Possibly. As
the one who gets the crowd going, kind of the second one to come in and keep things going. Less of an in the background and more of a, okay, now you got the intro, let's pump it up. Kind of.
Well, I was kind of thinking of Paul and Apollos, as far as we can tell, seem to sort of work together. Like Apollo seems to follow Paul, as far as we can tell. Whereas Cephas, who is also known as Simon Peter of the disciples, sort of seems to be working with a different team. And so I was kind of thinking that if Apollos and Paul come from the Muppets, then Cephas should come from Sesame Street. as not exactly a rival, but as a separate set of, of folks going around doing a similar thing. And I'm a little fuzzy on exactly who that would be, but I think Ernie's not a bad choice because Ernie does get along with people and like talking to people. And I suppose maybe Bert is following him along and making sure that he gets stuff right.
I mean, also Big Bird could be. Big Bird gathers people and...
Yeah, he's good at that.
Yeah. Thanks for joining us. Catch us next time when we'll discuss nerdery connections to the scripture readings for Transfiguration Sunday with our special guest panel, Reverend Nicole Garcia and Reverend Emerson Remy. This podcast has been produced by us, Emily Ewing and Kay Rohloff. For more fun, check us out on Twitter and Facebook at Nerds at Church, or contact us at nerdsatchurch@gmail.com.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you want access to our uncut guest episodes and interviews, live Q&As, and more, support us on Patreon at patreon.com/nerdsatchurch. It's cheaper than an anger management course.
Definitely. Unless it's court-ordered, because then that might be free. But
I'm sure they'd still charge you for the transportation, but yeah.
Yeah. Also, let us know on Facebook or Twitter who you would cast for Let's Make a Muppets musical for this episode.
As the ancient Christians said, Pax Vobiscum.